At some point, something strange begins to happen. You no longer trust your reactions. A moment occurs, a comment, a tone. Something inside you immediately feels uncomfortable, but instead of responding, you pause. Because another thought appears almost instantly. Maybe I'm reacting wrong. The feeling is still there, but now it is followed by hesitation. Was that actually rude? Was that disrespectful? Or am I just overthinking it again? That small pause becomes the beginning of something bigger. Before, your reactions were automatic. If something felt hurtful, you noticed it. If something felt unfair, you responded. Your emotions acted like signals. They helped you understand your environment. They helped you understand people. But slowly, that signal system begins to change. Now every reaction feels uncertain. You feel irritation, but then you question it, you feel hurt, but then you analyze it. You feel uncomfortable, but then you immediately search for another explanation. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. Maybe I misunderstood the tone. Maybe I'm reacting too quickly. Sometimes the reaction disappears before it fully forms. You feel something rising, but you suppress it immediately, not because the feeling was wrong, but because you're no longer confident in it. So instead of trusting the reaction, you investigate it. There are moments where this hesitation becomes very visible. Someone says something that clearly sounds dismissive. You feel the reaction immediately, but instead of responding, you look at their expression, you analyze their tone, you search for signs that you might have misunderstood. And during that brief moment of analysis, the opportunity to respond quietly disappears. Other times, the reaction arrives later. You leave a conversation feeling slightly uncomfortable. Something about the moment didn't sit right, but you can't immediately explain why. Hours later, the conversation returns to your mind. You replay the words, you replay the tone, you replay your own reaction, trying to determine whether the feeling was justified, trying to determine whether the reaction was reasonable. Sometimes the doubt becomes so familiar that it appears even before the reaction. A moment begins to unfold. Someone says something slightly sharp. You feel the emotional signal starting to appear. But before the reaction even reaches the surface, your mind interrupts it. Maybe I'm overthinking this. Maybe it's not worth reacting. Maybe I misunderstood again. And the reaction fades before it ever becomes visible. This usually doesn't happen suddenly. It develops slowly, one conversation at a time, one correction at a time, one comment at a time. You're overthinking it. You're too sensitive. That's not what happened. You're remembering it wrong. Each sentence introduces a small amount of doubt, and over time, those doubts accumulate. Eventually, something subtle changes inside your mind. Your reactions stop feeling like information. They start feeling like potential mistakes, something to double check, something to control, something that might embarrass you if it turns out to be wrong. So you hesitate. You start replaying moments before reacting. You analyze the situation from multiple angles. You imagine how the other person might interpret your reaction. You imagine how the conversation could unfold. You imagine how your response might be criticized. And by the time you finish analyzing everything, the moment has already passed. Sometimes you say nothing, not because the moment felt right, but because responding now feels risky. What if I'm wrong? What if I misunderstood again? What if I make the situation worse? Silence begins to feel safer than reacting. Over time, you begin noticing another change. Your reactions become smaller. You laugh off comments that once bothered you. You ignore behavior that once felt disrespectful. You brush aside moments that once would have started a conversation, not because they stopped affecting you, but because reacting now feels uncertain. You might even notice yourself adjusting your personality slightly, becoming calmer, more careful, less reactive, less expressive, not because you naturally changed, but because every reaction now passes through a filter built from repeated doubt. This is one of the quiet outcomes of prolonged psychological pressure. The goal is not always to control your actions directly. Sometimes the goal is simply to destabilize your internal compass. Because once you stop trusting your own reactions, someone else's interpretation becomes more powerful. There is a psychological reason this happens. Emotions act as a rapid evaluation system. They allow us to interpret social situations quickly, to notice tension, to notice disrespect, to notice discomfort. But when those emotional signals are repeatedly questioned, your brain starts filtering them differently. Instead of acting on the signal, you start evaluating whether the signal itself is valid. That evaluation creates delay, and delay weakens confidence. Every time you question your reaction, your brain learns to distrust the initial signal slightly more, until eventually your first instinct becomes the least trusted one. Another effect appears quietly. You begin observing yourself from the outside, monitoring your reactions as if someone else were evaluating them, checking your tone, checking your expressions, checking whether your reaction might be too much. Instead of experiencing the moment naturally, you begin managing your response, and that internal monitoring can become exhausting because every reaction now requires analysis. Every feeling requires justification. Every emotional signal must pass through a filter, and slowly the natural flow of emotional responses begins to disappear. But there is something important to understand. Your reactions are not random. They exist for a reason. They are responses to information, to tone, to behavior, to patterns. And when those reactions are constantly questioned, it does not necessarily mean they were wrong. Sometimes it means someone benefits from you ignoring them, because reactions create boundaries. They signal when something feels unfair. They signal when something crosses a line. And if those signals disappear, boundaries become harder to maintain.
There are also small behavioral signs when this pattern develops. You hesitate before expressing disagreement. You soften your tone before sharing an opinion. You apologize before reacting emotionally. You begin sentences with phrases like, "Maybe I'm wrong." "I might be overthinking this." "I'm not sure if this is important," even when the reaction originally felt clear. Sometimes you even notice that your reactions appear only later, long after the moment has passed. When you are alone, when the conversation is over, when the pressure of the interaction has disappeared. Only then do you realize that something felt wrong. Only then do you notice the reaction that never had space to appear. So if you find yourself constantly questioning your reactions, if you hesitate before trusting what you feel, if you replay conversations long after they end trying to determine whether your reaction was valid, pause for a moment, not to judge the reaction, but to notice the pattern. Because when someone begins doubting their own emotional signals, it becomes much easier for someone else to define reality for them. And the moment you start trusting your reactions again is the moment that influence begins to weaken. And the moment you see it is the moment the erosion stops.